Hey everybody, how's it going? This video, I'm gonna quickly walk through Harold Bloom's The Art of Reading Poetry, which is a pretty dense essay, but I think it really helps set up and frame the class. So I'm not gonna close read the whole essay. We'd be here forever. I'm just gonna touch on some highlights that specifically work toward the discussion board as well. So let's jump right in. Let's pull up good old Uncle Harold's uh, essay. So here we go. All right. Harold Bloom, The Art of Reading Poetry. Okay, I'm gonna just skip around and look at a few of the pages and talk about some things quickly. Poetry essentially is figurative language, concentrated so that its form is both expressive and evocative. That's Bloom's definition of poetry. Figuration is a departure from the literal, and the form of a great poem itself can be a trope, turning, or figure. A common dictionary equivalent for figurative language is metaphorical. Think of my father lived in a dirty dish mausoleum. That's metaphorical, right? But a metaphor actually is a highly specific figure, or turning from the literal. Burke, a profound student of rhetoric, or the language of figures, distinguished four fundamental tropes: irony, synecdoche, metonymy, and metaphor. So irony is a definition. So look these up too. Irony, saying one thing while meaning another. Right? Synecdoche, symbol, is a figurative substitution of a part for a whole, a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole, or vice versa. Metonymy is the substitution of the name of an attribute or adjunct for that of the thing meant. For example, when someone calls like business people a suit, right? Uh, Synecdoche would be like another would just be another symbol standing in for. They're similar. Metaphor is a word or phrase applied to an object or action in which it is not literally applicable. Again, back to the Henri Cole poem. My father lived in a dirty dish mausoleum. The father doesn't actually live in a mausoleum, but the speaker of the poem is calling the father's dwelling place a mausoleum. So those are the four tropes there. As Burke tells us, irony commits those who employ it to issues of presence and absence, since they are saying one thing while meaning something so different that it can be the precise opposite. We learn to wince when Hamlet says, "I humbly thank you," or its equivalent, since the prince generally is neither humble nor grateful. We now commonly call synecdoche symbol, since the figurative substitution of a part for a whole also suggests that incompletion in which something within the poem stands for something outside of it. Poets frequently identify more with one trope than with others. Among major American poets, Robert Frost, despite his mass reputation, favors irony, while Walt Whitman is the great master of synecdoche, right? Whitman, I'm in every blade of grass, right? In metonymy, contiguity replaces resemblance, since the name or prime aspect of anything is sufficient to indicate it, provided it is near in space to what serves as substitute. Childe Roland in Browning's remarkable monologue is represented at the very end by the slug horn, or trumpet, upon which he dauntlessly blows. Childe Roland to the dark tower came. We have our dark tower there. All right. Metaphor proper transfers the ordinary associations of one word to another. So when Hart Crane beautifully writes peonies with pony manes, enhancing his metaphor by the pun between peonies and pony, or again Crane, most intensely metaphorical of poets, refers to the Brooklyn Bridge's curve as its leap, and then goes on to call the bridge both harp and altar. Figurations or tropes create meaning which could not exist without them, and this making of meaning is largest in authentic poetry. So Bloom's differentiating between authentic poetry, right, real deep poetry, and the poetry we're looking at in this course throughout deals with these figurations or tropes, metaphor, where an excess or overflow emanates from figurative language and brings about a condition of newness. One of my definitions of great art, we're looking at poetry, but plug in fiction, painting, music. The condition, it breaks cliche. It doesn't just kind of fall into cliche, right? It breaks cliche. The Latin verb meaning rush or collapse led to this substantive ruin for what had fallen. Chaucer, equally at home in French and English, helped to domesticate ruin as a following. And here's he goes on with these ruins, looking at ruin and following here. We have bare ruined choirs, our Shakespeare sonnet, which I have on our syllabus. But we're gonna skip around. We're not gonna read this word for word. This is a very dense and good essay, but I want to look quickly. If you flip to page 3, we're just gonna hop around a bit now. This beginning of section 2, which is important. Language, to a considerable extent, is concealed figuration. Ironies and synecdoches, metonymies and metaphors that we recognize only when our awareness increases. Real poetry, you see, Bloom has real poetry, is aware of and exploits these ruined tropes, though it is both a burden and a resource. For later poets in a tradition, that language ages into this wealth of figuration. The major poets of the 20th century in Britain and America were those who could best exploit this equivocal richness. Thomas Hardy, W.B. Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, and Hart Crane among them. Now, here I want to pause quickly because we're reading this Bloom essay. What does Polonius say about Hamlet? There's a method to my madness. We're reading this Bloom essay for a specific reason. You see, Bloom focuses on this group of poets who he calls major poets who construct real poetry. And they're all dead white guys, right? Hart Crane, queer, and we're going to read Crane's legend. But my goal is to take Bloom's essay, what he's saying, what he's applying to these canonical, immortal poets, and I want to apply it onto the frames of all of our diverse poets we're going to read this semester as well. We're going to read a lot of, black and brown poets, queer poets, poets from different areas, different parts, a real diverse group. And I'm going to argue that those poets, in both similar and different ways, construct this real poetry using many of these tropes. All right? So real poetry is aware of and exploits those tropes. So there's an awareness. And this specifically relates to the next video and the next essay, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent, which one must have an awareness of what has come before, a history of poetry, and then one must both consume that history and break free from it. All right, so here's Eliot, which is our segue into Eliot here, but we're going to skip. We're going to skip this part here, though this is really good. I like this moment when the strangeness of meaning, I think great art as well, and we can argue about this. There's a strangeness that on first glimpse, at first glance, it may make us uncomfortable. Good art challenges us. It doesn't tell us what we already know. It doesn't necessarily comfort us. Eliot's Wasteland here, Hart Crane. This is important. I want to skip to page 5, top of 3 here. And Bloom, this is one of our discussion board questions. Greatness in poetry depends upon splendor of figurative language and on cognitive power, or what Emerson termed, Ralph Waldo Emerson, meter-making argument. Shakespeare is first among poets at representing thought, which pragmatically does not differ from thinking in poetry, a process not yet fully adumbrated. So this is Bloom. This is Bloom's argument, splendor of figurative language and cognitive power, knowing and making art, right? Here he has a note on Hamlet, Shakespeare, Stevens here. Memory is crucial for all thought, but particularly so for poetic thinking. Poetic memory allows recognition, which he regards as Fletcher as a central modality of thinking for literary purposes. Recognition here initially is Aristotle's anagnoresis, the recognition scene toward which tragedy quests. Discovery can be a synonym for recognition in this scene. Memory here. And this means not just our own personal memory of things that happen. This is a memory of the history of poetry, art, what has come before. Bloom's staking a claim, making an argument that, if we want to be great poets, we need to study what has come before us. And that goes with Eliot too. Another definition of poetic power is that it so fuses thinking and remembering that we cannot separate the two process. Can a poem of authentic strength be composed without remembering a prior poem, whether by the self or by another? Literary thinking relies upon literary memory, and the drama of recognition in every writer contains with it a moment of coming to terms with another writer, or with an earlier version of the self. Poetic thinking is contextualized by poetic influences. So that's really important. This is Bloom's argument, and I agree. Think of any art we create. It's coming from, it's not created in a vacuum. It's coming from other art. And our goals, our plans is to take everything we've known before and to create our own voice and to, in many ways, make it new. All right, quickly. Page 6. We're going to skip around. We're going to skip a big chunk of this. I like this part here at the beginning, section 4. The art of reading poetry begins with mastering elusiveness in particular poems, from the simple to the very complex. We can start with quite short poems, but just, mastering elusiveness. And basically allusions, elusiveness, is when poems and poets refer to other works, to other arts, to other things, right? So really, to comprehend and master the art of reading poetry, it begins with being a knowledgeable, well-rounded, well-read individual. Because if not, you miss all these references, right? And poetry is built upon other poetry and is built upon other references. Quickly again, so this is another important moment for the discussion board. We're going to skip around to page 8. I have my hard copy here. All right, here we go. This is important. Recognizing and interpreting allusions depends upon both the reader's learning and her tact. T.S. Eliot, in his charmingly outrageous and frequently unreliable Note to the Wasteland, charts some of his allusions while evading others. His famous lines, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," clearly alludes to the morbid young protagonist of Tennyson's Maud, who cries out to us, "And my heart is a handful of dust." And then we have how the Wasteland, if check out T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, alludes to these other poems here. Allusion then can be a mode of evasion or of warding off a precursor. Repressed reference is a defense against overinfluence. And this little section focuses on allusion here. Alive in the present. Allusion is only one strand in the relationship between later and earlier poems. More than any other kind of imaginative literature, poetry brings its own past alive into its present. Think of that. I mean, on the surface, that's a very kind of, banal statement, but it's also a profound statement. This is the thing with poetry, too. It does something with time. It brings its own past alive into the present. So if you're adhering to Bloom's definition of a learned, elusive poet, you bring that past with you, you make it alive into the present, and you also make it new, right? So that's a really important thing. There's a haunting in poetic tradition, one that transcends the sorrows of influence. And I love this moment too with Bloom. Bloom can be a controversial thinker, right? He's set in his ways. He's kind of he knows what he knows. He likes what he likes. I love this moment though too. When Bloom kind of warns of a new poet's fear that there is little left for him, her, or themselves to do. In truth, there is everything remaining to be thought of and sung, provided an individual voice is attained. You take what's been done before, because there's really nothing new emotionally, psychologically, philosophically. But when you create your own individual poetic voice, everything remains. You can do anything. Art is inexhaustible, right? That little statement there. All right. So that's another that's another section that goes toward our discussion board. Quickly, we're going to skip these examples because we'd be here for hours and hours of Bloom's other poets. I want to skip quickly. I'm going to try to keep this video relatively short. Skip to page 13. Now, this I both want to challenge Bloom's moment here, and this is one of the main reasons I want to bring this essay in, and we're starting with this difficult essay. So this is important here. This is a really controversial statement Bloom makes. In many ways, he could even get canceled for this, but I'm going to take him to task and argue with him. So really pay attention to this. Part 6. What makes one poem better than another? The question always central to the art of reading poetry is more crucial today than ever before, since extra poetic considerations of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and assorted ideologies increasingly constitute the grounds for judgment in the educational institutions and the media of the English-speaking world. So what Bloom is doing right here is he's railing against identity in art and poetics. And I'm going to take him to task. I don't think, and here's what he's saying. It's very difficult, right? I don't think these things can ever be separated. I think these things are foundationally and subsequently maybe some of the most important things. And we're gonna push against Bloom when we read some of our poems later in this semester. I think all these things are important, and they're impossible to separate when composing a poem or a poet. However, what Bloom is saying is that these things necessarily can't be the initial forefront of the poem, and I'm going to push back, though, that you can have these things, but there has to be some type of artistic creation as well. You can have these things, but there has to be some type of aesthetic presence as well. So what we're going to do when we read our diverse poets later, we're going to push back on this Bloom statement here. And in some ways, Bloom, and I don't think I'm misreading this, we have this long section on Hart Crane, whereas Crane's identification as a homosexual is extremely important to his poems. However, Crane also uses that elusiveness, difficulty, history of poetry. So what Crane does is meld both identity and the intellectual learning. So keep this in mind here, and we're gonna kind of measure this essay up later on. All right, try and wrap this thing up. The whole essay is fascinating and learned, by the way. We're gonna skip to page 19. Where are we? 19. All right. What do I want to say here? There's a fascinating part at the beginning of this where Bloom says it has that quality. Again, great poetry. We're looking at the discussion board. What makes, according to Bloom, great poetry? The quality of the inevitable. So when something is inevitable, it couldn't be any other way. He's applying it to this poem. I'm thinking of our first poem, Oil and Steel. I don't think that first line could be anything but my father lived in a dirty dish mausoleum. I don't think the end of that poem could be anything but this man who never showed me much affection but gave me a knack for solitude, which has been mostly useful. That mostly, which makes that poem paradoxical, difficult, resist closure. There is an inevitability in great poetry that it couldn't be any other way. Think of a song you love. You love the song because the lyrics couldn't be anything else but what they are. A movie you love, right? So this inevitability right here, the two modes of the memorable. So we have that inevitability. And just to continue with this inevitability, let's look at, he goes on this for a little bit on page 21. We have this ancient idea of the sublime, which something sublime is what our minds really can't comprehend, what we can't wrap around. Longinus tells us that in the experience of the sublime, we apprehend a greatness to which we respond by a desire for identification, so that we will become what we behold. Loftiness is a quality that emanates from the realm of aspiration, from what Wordsworth called a sense of something evermore about to be. So this idea of the sublime, we want to grasp it. Again, too, inevitability, unavoidable phrasing seems to me then a crucial attribute of great poetry, right? But how can a reader tell for herself whether a poem she has ever seen before possesses the quality of authentic poetry? So here's what Bloom's giving us: a blueprint to how to read a poem and identify a great poem. So a bunch of questions. What does it mean and how does the meaning attained? Can I judge how good it is? Has it transcended the history of its own time and the events of the poet's life? Or is it now only a period piece? And then he close reads Crane's Voyages. And I've purposely chosen Crane's Legend. It's a shorter poem, but and I think Crane's Legend transcends, it was written a long time ago, but I think it transcends. And I think it hits many of the things what Bloom is saying here, right? But it goes back to what I was just arguing about Bloom in that controversial area. Look at this. We have a specific, and here's where Bloom argues, though. Here's about Crane's personal life, but it's melded with all these allusions and traditions. The first draft of this visionary lyric was begun in April 1924, 3 months away from Hart Crane's 25th birthday and the early ecstatic phase of his love for a Danish sailor, Emil Oetfer. So Crane was carrying on this relationship with this sailor. The second voyage is part of the sequence of 6 printed complete at the very end of this volume, and he's going to close read Crane's lyric. But what Bloom does, he showcases how Crane both ties in his personal life and also all these allusions: Shakespeare, Marlowe, Blake, Shelley, Melville, Whitman, Dickinson, Eliot, Williams, etc., etc. So there's that. So there's like a combination there. All right. All right. And again, this is he close reads this poem. It's brilliant how he reads this. We're going to skip around a little bit more. And I want to jump into the ending. We'll get to the ending. Let's flip to page 28, which is really... So this is all on Hart Crane here. It's wonderful. This is a wonderful... Spend some time on this. All right. So let's skip to 28. Let me pull up my notes here as we move toward the end. Hart Crane is a difficult, great poet, but very good, even great poetry need not be overly difficult. Difficulty in great poetry can be of several very different kinds. Sustained elusiveness, as in the learned poetry of Milton and Thomas Gray, demands a high level of reader's literacy. Cognitive originality, the particular mark of Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson, requires enormous intellectual agility as the reader's share. Personal myth-making, as in William Blake and William Butler Yeats, at first can seem obscure, but the coherence of Blakean and Yeatsian myth yields to familiarity. I think that poetry at its greatest, Dante, Shakespeare, Donne, Milton, Blake, has one broad and essential difficulty. It is a true mode for expanding our consciousness. Wow. Bloom's claim that great poetry expands our consciousness. That's a damn bold statement, and I like it, but it's bold, right? Great poetry, and you could plug in great art, expands our consciousness. And this is sometimes why we struggle with it being difficult, or we don't understand it right away. I mean, when we easily understand something, when we're fed something that we know, it was just telling us what we already know. It's telling us what we already want to hear. So a lot of times we got to struggle. We got to fight with. We got to read and reread great poetry, great art. There's this idea of strangeness. And I do agree. Like when something's strange or a weirdness, it brings forth a poetic criterion, right? More truly and more strange. And here's Barfield's definition of strangeness. I really love this. So this might also resist interpretation as well initially. When something's really strange, It takes us longer to grasp it, but only through experiencing the strangeness of great art can our consciousness expand. It is not correlative with wonder, for wonder is our reaction to things which we are conscious of not quite understanding, or at any rate of understanding less than we have thought. The element of strangeness and beauty has the contrary effect. It arises from contact with a different kind of consciousness from our own. Different, yet not so remote that we cannot partly share it. As indeed in such a connection the mere word contact implies, strangeness in fact arouses wonder when we do not understand, aesthetic imagination when we do. Consciousness is a central term here. So there's consciousness, right? And here's wrapping it up. And you know, we skipped around and jumped through this essay. I'm going on a half hour. We can close read this whole thing. I think it's wonderful. But here, this is really important. Consciousness is the central term here. As Barfield intimates, consciousness is the poetry, what marble is a sculpture, the material that is being worked. Words are figurations of consciousness. Metaphorical of consciousness, the poet's words invite us to share in a strangeness. A felt change in consciousness is one of Barfield's definitions of the poetic effect. And I relate to this, what fascinates me most in the greatest Shakespearean characters, Falstaff, Hamlet, Iago, Lear, Cleopatra, the extraordinary changes that come about when they overhear themselves. As James Wood remarks, actually they become conscious of listening to Shakespeare because in overhearing themselves, what they are hearing is Shakespeare. They become themselves more truly and more strange because they are free artists of themselves. I love that. Free artists of themselves. Can we become those things? The work of great poetry is to aid us to become free artists of ourselves. Even Shakespeare cannot make me into Falstaff or Hamlet, but all great poetry asks us to be possessed by it. To possess it by memory is a start, and to augment our consciousness is the goal. The art of reading poetry is an authentic training in the augmentation of consciousness, perhaps the most authentic of healthy modes. That's a grand statement. And I make this claim too when I mention that reading in our syllabus by encountering, and we're going to take Bloom's essay and apply it to our diverse body of poets. Can we read diverse poets and people who are different than us? And can that help us expand our consciousness? Can those things help us become free artists of ourselves? That's the question I want us to think about throughout the semester.